evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to In the Trenches. I'm back from my week hiatus. It is Jeffrey Dubroff alongside Garrett Schwartz. It's January 23rd. It's a beautiful Tuesday. And boy, do we have a great show for you tonight. Maybe one of the best we've ever had. Later on, we have Richard Deitsch, a Sports Illustrated media podcast and writer, coming on to talk to us. That's going to be a great interview, but we shall begin, and we'd be remiss if we don't talk about it. USC, always in the news, always something going on with USC, and whether or not it's the basketball team who they swept this weekend. They're hitting their stride, but to the football field, USC announced just this past weekend that T. Martin, the offensive coordinator for the Trojans, has signed a new contract, a multi-year extension. However, we're not entirely sure because, USC doesn't release those figures. Garrett, this is a coach, an offensive coordinator that you and I, we struggle to find the good side of. And a lot of people, a lot of fans have often called for T. Martin to be relieved of his duties. Were you surprised by this re-signing?
I was not at all surprised. I am a little bit disappointed, but it makes a lot of sense. This is a high-profile guy. He was getting NFL looks, interviewed by the Oakland Raiders for their head coaching vacancy. He was rumored to be brought in rumored to be a serious candidate for the Tennessee Volunteer head coaching job. So clearly a high-profile guy. But to me, from the outside, this looks a lot like a desperate hire for USC, right? We just lost Ty Helton to the University of Tennessee. He's their new offensive coordinator. New running back coach Dylan McCullough out after only one season. He's going to the Kansas City Chiefs. And again, going back to T. Martin, who's getting looks from the Raiders and Tennessee and potentially a couple other jobs. If you're Clay Helton and Lynn Swann, you're looking and saying, okay, we might be in a little bit of trouble if T. Martin walks away here. So let's throw a boatload of money at him and a couple more years to tack on at the end of his contract and make sure he stays.
Yeah, I agree. It seems desperate, and you mentioned the Dylan McCullough leaving for Kansas City, leaving the running back coach vacant. That's going to be a big hire for Clay Helton because that's a coach who developed Indiana players into NFL talent. But back to T. Martin, the thing I see with the T. Martin hire, and I don't think you and I can disagree on this. T. Martin is since being on the staff since 2012 has been by far the best recruiter on this team, and people know that nationally. People have often said that an SEC school, one that has enough money, and not that USC doesn't have the money, but one that has enough money to hire a recruiter would pay a lot of money to have T. Martin as their premier recruiter on their staff. To me, it's interesting. I think it gives an element of stability. But what's interesting to me is people are saying, and again, none of this is confirmed, is that this is a contract that is rumored to be longer than Clay Helton's. And that's what's strange to me is you never hear assistant coaches having longer contracts than the head coach. And part of me also thinks, Garrett, that this could be a hire, and I said this to you before we came on, that maybe once again takes the pressure off Clay Helton a little bit. Because people have often groveled about T. Martin, they grovel about Clay Helton, and now Clay Helton has the ability to say, okay, I got rid of T. Martin. If things go south to start the year, which some people are pretty dead set on happening, Clay can say, all right, I got rid of T, we'll be all right. But I think T. Martin, since being promoted to offense coordinator in 2016, has a good resume.
So you think T. Martin could be a scapegoat for Clay Helton should things head south? See, I don't agree with that, and I'll tell you why. Number one, this is totally a Clay Helton hire. It's a Clay Helton personnel decision. So if the hire goes poorly, I think a lot of that accountability is going to fall onto Clay. And number two, I don't think it's a risky hire by any means. I don't personally like the hire. That being said, let's look at his resume since he's been at USC, right? He led an offense that won the Rose Bowl. He led an offense that won a Pac-12 championship. This season, season, 2017, USC ranked 13th in total offense. There is a lot to like about T. Martin in addition to what you were saying about him being an extraordinary recruiter. If you look at the 2018 recruiting class, an average 4.2 star rating in 2018. So arguably, potentially, while not a huge recruiting class, could be the most talented recruiting class coming in this coming season. But I can't imagine T. Martin falling on Clay Helton's sword next season. First off, is Clay Helton even on the hot seat? Who knows? I think a lot of T. Martin's struggles come at the hands of Clay Helton. Let's not forget that it's been rumored that T. Martin doesn't even get to call third down for the Trojans. In the Cotton Bowl, it was interim offensive coordinator Brian Ellis, who's now since been promoted to full-time offensive coordinator. So would T. Martin take the blame for Clay Helton? I don't know, but Jeff, we talked about the recruiting. We talked about, Martin's experience as a USC coach. But let's just talk X's and O's for a minute. From a strictly coordinator perspective, do you like T. Martin?
It's hard to say no when you've had a Rose Bowl and a Pac-12 championship under your belt since him being promoted to the offensive coordinator position. Look, I will say this. There are times where I really do and there are times where I don't. And I know that is very vague and that's not an answer, a straight answer, but you have to look. That Stanford Pac-12 championship game, T. Martin called a terrific game. Called a fantastic game, and USC won. There are often times, though, where it looks as if the offense, has no idea what they're doing.
7 points in the Cotton Bowl.
That I would, again, I've always said that you got to attribute that more to the turnovers. That has nothing, in my opinion, obviously, to do with play calling. However, at the same time, you also have had the quarterback who is most likely going to be taken first overall in this year's NFL draft as the guy that you can rely on. And they did that, in my opinion, far too much, is to rely on Sam Darnold and didn't always come out to work for the Trojans this season. But I'll say one thing. It's going to be interesting what T. Martin does next year. And unfortunately, we won't be here, but I would have a more definite answer next year when he does not have Sam Darnold. But I'll ask the same to you.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, and you could ask the same question about Clay Helton, is what is Clay Helton without Sam Darnold? What is T. Martin without Sam Darnold? Unfortunately, I don't really think we're going to get the answer to that question anytime soon with JT Daniels coming in.
If he starts,
which
I think he should.
I'd expect him to. Whether or not Clay Helton has the cojones to make the move, that's to be determined. But look, I think T. Martin is fool's gold. And I'll tell you why. The numbers and the resume is flashy. We talked about the Rose Bowl, the Pac-12 title, the 13th total offense in college football. But I think you got to look a little bit deeper into this. Number one, while USC did have the 13th overall total offense, they were 35th in scoring offense. That is not impressive by any means when you have the potential number one overall pick in the NFL, right, on your team, and a pretty loaded backfield in Ronald Jones and Stephen Carr. And looking even deeper, okay, you say, look, USC put up the 13th most yards in all of college football. Look who we were playing this year. You have 5 teams that USC had on the schedule this year, 5 teams that ranked in the bottom 20 of all college football Division I teams. That would be UCLA, Oregon State, Arizona, Colorado, and Arizona State. And right behind them is Cal. They're in the top 30 worst defenses in all of college football. Yeah. So, look, if you're T. Martin, heck, if I'm the offensive coordinator for USC coaching Sam Darnold against whatever abomination of defenses we were against, I could coach them to score 30 points a game. So it's really hard to judge the T. Martin hire when he's had so much given to him. My biggest problem with Martin and Helton is what happens when we pit the USC team up against other elite teams, right? We've looked miserable against Alabama. We've looked miserable against Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl. We looked miserable against a top 10 Notre Dame team this past season. So, again, we know that USC can beat up on the poor, but what happens when you stack up elite talent against elite talent and supposedly elite coaches against elite coaches? I do not think we have elite coaches.
I know, and I agree with you in that. And I said it in the show 2 weeks ago that the coaching was so the coaching difference, the skill sets between the two coaches of Urban Meyer and Clay Helton, in my opinion, during that Cotton Bowl game, were black and white. I mean, it was just as if, and Greg Schiano, let's not forget, Ohio State's defensive coordinator, they just knew it seemed as if they knew everything that was about to happen. Granted, they played the second half in a very slow pace. They didn't score in the second half, but they also didn't let us score. But, I mean, I agree with what you said, that this is a very Clay Helton hire. I think it's a very USC hire. I mean, since we've been here, Garrett, I don't think we've seen a coaching hire in one of the major sports that has been from the outside, a head coaching hire at least, that being just Clay Helton. And although that was Pat Hayden's hire, and Pat Hayden hired Andy Enfield, and that's a whole different story. But we're going to know next year. And luckily, JT Daniels, I think, and a lot of people think, is a special talent. So maybe for 3 more years, T. Martin gets to look like one of the best assistant coaches in the country. And let's not forget, this is 2 years in a row that he has been nominated for the Broyles Assistant Coach of the Year award. Not too shabby. It's easy to be upset from the outside when we don't know what's going on in the headset. And that's my take on it. And I'm not happy, but I'm not upset. I think there are much worse coaches out there, or teams in much worse positions than we are.
So you and I can agree, not the worst of hirings, fine, right? It's an okay hire.
It's frustrating.
But look, you said next season we're going to see, how good T. Martin really is. I'm going to disagree a little bit, just because if JT Daniels is as good as everyone says he is. Look, T. Martin, in my opinion, has got to be on a short leash. You got 4 of 5 returning offensive linemen. You got a 5-star quarterback coming in. You finally got a wide receiver group this season that should be pretty darn good behind Michael Pittman and Tyler Vaughns. So T. Martin has all the tools at his disposal. We're going to see if he has the ability to get the job done, and he has no excuse not to.
I mean, you've talked me into it just a little bit. If JT Daniels can come in and have a Jacob Fromm type season, there's no reason USC should not repeat his Pac-12 champions. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves.
We'll get there, because
way ahead of ourselves.
At dinner just a few hours ago, I just thought there's a serious possibility USC starts off the season 1-3. But anyway, that's for another show. Different. Anyway,
moving on. When we return, Richard Deitsch, a Sports Illustrated reporter, has the Sports Illustrated Media podcast that everyone should subscribe to, joins us, a very special guest. This is very exciting. Garrett, with his fast little Twitter fingers, made this one happen. We will be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to In the Trenches. I am Garrett Schwartz. With me is Jeff Dubrov, and we are joined by a very special guest today, Richard Deitsch, a writer and reporter with Sports Illustrated. He writes the SI Media column. He also hosts the SI Media podcast. I highly recommend subscribing. Basically, he does a series of podcasts each week of one-on-one interviews, most recently with Jim Nantz and Katie Nolan, who now works with with ESPN. He also does a series of roundtable discussions talking about topics like NFL ratings and people who are under 30 who are looking to break into the sports media industry, which we will touch on in a little bit. But Richard, the main reason Jeff and I wanted to have you on was to talk about the Pac-12 and its commissioner, Larry Scott. Jeff and I have been very critical of the Pac-12 conference. And before we get into any of the specific grievances, we wanted to ask you, what is the overall kind of general perception of the Pac-12 conference in the sports and sports media industries, and maybe ranked up against the other Power 5 conferences? And actually, before you answer the question, I wanted to thank you again for joining us.
Well, good to be here, Garrett. First of all, why is the show In the Trenches, Garrett? Is that your title, or what is that the name of the show, and you guys are just the new hosts of the show?
So Jeff and I started the show a few years ago, and Jeff and I tend to disagree quite a bit, and
more than quite a bit.
And the main focus of our podcast is USC football and USC sports, and we just thought In the Trenches, kind of has the good vibe of football and roughing it out and battling on air. So yeah, we picked that name.
All right. Well, I mean, the other thing, Garrett, is I admire how you've struggled so hard in that Southern California sunshine attending USC. So props to you for somehow being able to get through like the tough winters of 55 degrees and such. So,
hey, you know, those first few games of the season are actually brutally hot. It's not so easy to sit in the Coliseum at 100 degrees temperatures.
That's true. I admire the courage that you pulled off for that.
Thank you. So going back to the question, what is the overall perception of the Pac-12, by the big players in media and sports media, and how do you think the Pac-12 stacks up, in terms of popularity or prestige among the other Power 5 conferences?
Well, I mean, I think, this is more of a sort of a perception question, and I think a lot of how you would determine what the perception is probably, how big a college sports fan you are, where you live in the country. So there's a lot of variables there. That said, I think you'd have to probably look at it sport by sport, and I think people obviously think in terms of the major sports, college football, college basketball, I think if you're a sports fan, I think you think the Pac-12 is a legitimate Power 5 conference. Obviously, it doesn't have the same kind of cachet in football as the SEC or the Big Ten, but, it's still a legitimate conference that, if things break right, always should have a team near the top of that conference with a chance for a national championship. Basketball obviously is a little bit trickier, but, again, sort of the same premise. There are probably college basketball conferences top to bottom, certainly in the women's game, that the women's game Pac-12 is really, really strong. Maybe there's other men's conferences that are a little bit better. But I think reputationally in those sports, I think the reputation is pretty good. You have to keep in mind that so much of like what conference is quote unquote hot, so to speak, is often so determined by like who wins the biggest title. So Alabama wins, and people are like SEC football is number one, or it's hot. It's not exactly always the parallel, but you get the benefit of that if your conference wins a title. But you go down the list in terms of the Pac-12, and you go to some of the quote-unquote minor sports or niche sports, the conference is always a powerhouse. You guys should probably not forget that. Some of these sports might not be televised the way the big sports are, but whether it's volleyball, track and field, Pac-12 was always sort of a top high tier top kind of 3 or 4 conference when it comes to that stuff. So, I would not. I'm speaking from somebody who lives in New York, so I'm very, very far away from where you guys are in LA and very far away from the West Coast. But the Pac-12 network doesn't have some kind of damaged reputation compared to the other Power 5 conferences. I just think there are certain conferences that when you think of certain sports, immediately that conference is going to come to mind. And because of Alabama's dominance in particular, I think when it comes to football, people are always going to think SEC first, and then probably Big Ten second, just because of the coaches in that conference.
Really interesting, Richard. You bring up a good point about the smaller niche sports for the Pac-12. I mean, USC water polo, men's water polo has been to a national championship game against either Cal or UCLA 8 straight seasons. So, I mean, the big money sports are where lately, at least, we've seen, especially from a USC perspective, not having a Pac-12 team in the playoff except for Oregon 2 years back. But I want to ask a question, again, related to the...
Listen, I realize, you guys are in the middle of it and you're in the thick of it. I understand that. 2 years back, that's not, we're not talking about the Bills never winning a Super Bowl. You know what I mean? Like 2 years back, that's still fairly recent history that Oregon team had a chance to win a national title. Now, admittedly, they got beat pretty big, but they were still in the final game, which always speaks to usually the strength, at least at the top end of a conference.
Yeah, but we are also coming off a season in which the Pac-12 champion, who was, again, 3-loss USC, wasn't even remotely in the playoff conversation.
Correct, yeah. I was just going to say, I agreed. This is you would have this better than me. As I'm talking to you guys, I'll try to look up the football standings. But this was for the all right, so now I have it here. Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the power teams historically. Stanford, 9-5 overall, right? Lost their bowl game to TCU. USC, 11-3, lost their bowl game to Ohio State. Arizona State, 7-6. Arizona 7-6, crushed in the bowl.
Oh no, it was a horrendous bowl season for the Pac-12.
I agree. It's a down, and Oregon, which has been, essentially over the last decade, a power team. 7-6 this year, and then they lose in their bowl game. So in terms of this year. You're right. The Pac-12 did not have a good year in football, and there are better people than me, the Bruce Feldman types, who would do this. But like off the top of my head, it seems like they're either the number 4 or the number 5 of the Power 5 conferences this year.
And yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It was a bad bowl season overall, and it's bad when your conference champion loses the way that USC did. But back to that Pac-12 title game, and and that game's on a Friday night. It was the only game on that Friday night. Yet, out of the Power 5 conference championship games, it comes in dead last in the ratings. When it comes to putting that game on a Friday night, is this a bad business decision from Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott, or do you think he's compensating for the fact that he knows if he puts it on Saturday, it's going to be dead last either way?
All right, so remind me again, who was in the final? USC versus
who? The Pac-12 title game was USC against Stanford in San Francisco, Levi Stadium. And I think what Jeffrey's basically going at is, look, the USC and the Pac-12 wasn't necessarily the most prestigious, talented conference in football. That being said, we don't believe that Larry Scott is positioning the conference in USC to be on the platform that it so deserves. So essentially, the Pac-12 Conference Championship game was the only conference championship game this year, which was played on a Friday. The other 4 Power 5 conferences played their game on a Saturday. What was the rationale?
Again, I have to sort of look at the contract, but, I guess that sort of the theory is you're trying to own a day of the week away from all the other conference finals, which is a Friday. But here's what I would say to that. I don't remember the rating. You guys can remind me of that. But part of the reason that rating was down is probably twofold. One, these are not the best USC and Stanford teams of all time, so you don't have the kind of fervor nationally for that game. And when it comes to the Pac-12 in particular, you have to have teams that have either a star player or a Heisman type of player or an unbelievable record, an undefeated record going into the championship game to draw the casual to mid-heavy college football fan on the East Coast. Because think about the commitment. The commitment is I have to stay up late to watch the conclusion of that game. Now, if it's like Christian McCaffrey type, who's like got a chance for a Heisman, or USC has Sam Darnold, who I think is potentially going to go to my team and have a high pick. Well, I might make that investment. If it's just sort of a USC team with multiple losses that is not going to be a title contender, if it's a Stanford team that's down like it was, I'm not surprised at that rating. I would just tell you guys that a lot of this is cyclical, and you're not so far removed from great Stanford teams that drew interest nationally, and you're not so far removed from great Oregon teams that drew interest nationally. And admittedly, you guys are young. We're only a decade plus removed from a USC team that was essentially like the Cavs and the Warriors, the Lionard Bush years. The ratings for those games, particularly that Texas game, through the roof. So I would just say to you guys, it is cyclical. And this year it just happened to be a very down year in that cycle. But the programs in the Pac-12, the schools are so famous, they have so many resources, they play in a big conference, that I would not be surprised if 2 years from now you've got a team that's one of the Final Four playoff teams in college football.
Yeah, for the record, the Pac-12 championship game was dead last in terms of ratings compared to the other 5 conferences.
But here's interesting. But you should go.
But I want to push back.
I want to go deeper.
I want to push back.
What the number is versus
so
those other.
It's 3. USC pulled about 3.5 million. Behind the ACC. ACC was 4th at 5.5. Big 12 was 3rd at 6. And then a huge jump, the Big Ten at about 13, and the SEC came at 13.5.
Primetime CBS, though. There are reasons for what did the Pac-12 game air on? ESPN?
ESPN.
Okay, so one, cable versus network. Network's always going to be bigger. Those other games had much better slots in terms of potential for audience. Again, I'm not Larry Scott. I'm not defending that conference. It doesn't matter to me either way. But a lot of times when it comes to viewership, you got to always keep in mind where is it viewing and what time is it viewing, and that's where the Pac-12 is always going to be against the 8 ball, because think of the percentage of the country that lives east of the Mississippi, and that's where the majority of the television homes are. You guys play in an area where the games are always going to be 3 hours against the Eastern time, so you really need a big draw to get the East Coast television homes to watch that game. That's why the Pac-12, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I bet you the last 10 years, they'd probably be closer to ranking 4th or 5th than 1st every year in those championship game viewerships.
Right, and look, this was a year in the Pac-12. I would argue that there were a lot of big storylines in that game. Obviously, you had Sam Darnold, who's a potential number 1 overall pick. You mentioned Christian McCaffrey, but don't forget Stanford's got Bryce Love, who was somewhat in that Heisman conversation.
Well, he was a Heisman finalist.
Right, true. But again, a Heisman Trophy potential guy that really did not get any kind of traction nationally until late, right? This wasn't Lamar Jackson. This wasn't a guy who had so much hype heading into the year. And when it comes to West Coast teams, you need that to really get people on the East Coast excited about watching those games. So I would say, you guys should certainly be critical of the conference when it's due. I would just tell you, as somebody who lives in New York City, that it's always going to be a hard sell for the Pac-12 conference to get eyeballs where I am. And you're going to need something sort of special to get your average casual sports fan, be it college basketball, college football, to tune into the Pac-12. You need stars, basically, or you need star teams. And it's just very clear, at least in football, they didn't have them this year.
Had USC gone to the playoff and fulfilled those massive expectations they had coming into the season, is USC an ideal college football playoff ratings matchup? Are they a team that people from all over the country would want to tune into? And I understand it's the college football playoff, so the ratings are going to be high either way, but how would they compare to an Alabama or an Auburn, a Georgia, teams like
Ohio State, Michigan?
They're a national draw, but there are teams that are above them. So I put Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, for sure above them. Notre Dame is above them. But then I think you start thinking about USC in that next slot. So if those teams that I just named, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, are Tier 1, USC would be at the top of Tier 2. So they're a national draw. They're definitely a national draw if they played against any of those teams I just mentioned. And then if they're on their own trying to carry a game, they're a draw. They're just not as big a draw as those schools, and the ratings bore that out. But they're a bigger draw than like Auburn nationally, or they're a bigger draw than Kentucky, or at least in football. I don't have all the Power 5 teams ahead of me, but they're in the top 10 when it comes to viewership powered kind of teams in the Power 5 conferences.
Yeah, the Cotton Bowl was the 6th highest rated college football bowl game of the season.
Makes sense, right.
So moving on Jeffrey and I's list of grievances for the Pac-12 and its commissioner, one of the probably major flops for the conference in the last few years is the making of the Pac-12 network. And there's a handful of reasons why it has not been as successful as, say, the SEC network or the Big Ten network, which are tied to ESPN and Fox respectively. In your opinion, if you could kind of just sum up, why has the Pac-12 network failed relatively, and do you think the idea of a network for the Pac-12 conference could be fixed?
Well, I'm not sure it's failed. First of all, I mean, it exists. It's got a pretty good digital footprint. It airs. The quality of the production, I think, is really, really high. So I would push back on that in terms of when I watch games. I think the quality is as good as the Big Ten network or the SEC network. In terms of carriage, the issue for the Pac-12 is literally what I just said. The issue is for getting viewership on some of these games. It is very hard. It is a very hard sell to get cable operators and/or subscribers in places that are not Pac-12 cities to pay money or pay the sports tier for the Pac-12. Now, no doubt some hardcore alums will, but as a general rule, the Big Ten network, the SEC network, their footprint is bigger. And it seems the interest in those conferences are greater than the Pac-12 east of the Mississippi. So if you want to compare it to those two networks, it's probably not as successful as them. But as sort of a standalone network that sort of started and is maintaining a standing, at least in terms of these conference networks, I don't think it's a bad product at all. I actually think. I'm an AP women's basketball voter, so I watch a lot of Pac-12 women's basketball, and they do actually a pretty good job of carrying stuff. And I think the quality of the production is pretty good. I watched the Big Ten, I watched the SEC network. SEC network obviously helped by the ESPN money and production, but I don't think the Pac-12 is a bad network at all.
Yeah, I should have been.
I think you have to have realistic expectations. The Pac-12 network is never going to be, in the same conversation as FS1 or ESPN2. It's just, it's never going to have that kind of national footprint because the conference can only go so far as a national footprint.
Right, and I guess I should have been a little bit more specific because I do agree with you. At the end of the day, the Pac-12 will never stack up to the SEC in terms of a network. But from a revenue standpoint, if you are USC, it has to be very hard to look at your revenue numbers from the Pac-12 network and stack it up against those numbers, say, for like a Rutgers and the Big Ten network. And it's kind of mind-boggling, at least for me, and as a USC student, to think, like, here's USC, this powerhouse brand, who's getting, nickel on the dime to what, a small school in the Big Ten like Rutgers is getting.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know the numbers because I'm not covering the Pac-12 sort of at all as part of my coverage. Guys like John Oran and Eric Fisher at the Sports Business Daily could give you the sort of the specifics of that. But I just wonder, in terms of the money, if that's more of a product of the Big Ten is just has a bigger cable foothold, and there's just more interest in the Big Ten in terms of the larger cable universe than there is in the Pac-12. I do know, if I remember, like around 2015 or 2016, I know the Pac-12 network was in something like 90 million homes. So again, to go to have started where they started, which I think they started in 2012, if I remember right, and to be in 90 million homes in 3 or 4 years, that's pretty impressive. Again, that just means you're available in 90 million homes. Certainly, you don't have 90 million subscribers or 90 million people watching, but they've done a pretty good job, if nothing else, of in terms of the major cable providers getting the stuff on. I know they've had some issues with DirecTV. You can remind me and stuff like that, but. Yeah, I think they don't have a carriage deal with DirecTV, if I remember. But I think the conference has done, generally speaking, fairly well with that network because I think the quality of the network is very high, and that's what I would judge it on more as a viewer than how profitable it is. As a general enterprise, these things are going to make money. It's really just a question of how much money they make. And
yeah, Richard, we'll move on and away from the Pac-12 network, but to two players that were in the Pac-12 this year.
I've shot out all my Pac-12 network data. I'm like it's like I'm J.R. Smith, basically. I have no more jumpers to give.
Oh, man. Anyway, though, the Pac-12, and more specifically Los Angeles, I think it's safe to say had the two most popular quarterbacks, if not athletes, in all of college football this year, in Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold. Two guys that
I would disagree with that.
Baker Mayfield's.
There you go. That's what I would go for. Yeah.
Anyway, let's stick with LA then. However, we hear about Josh Rosen coming out saying that he has to do 2 full-time jobs. Sam Darnold, along with being a student and an athlete, had an own podcast called Season of Sam. All these different things that college athletes, especially stars, are expected to do. Being that these athletes are unpaid, they're amateurs, does the media expect too much out of these college stars?
Absolutely. Not even a question. The expectations on these guys are absurd. They're not paid, which is ridiculous. And, we could have a 5-hour debate. Yeah, they got a college scholarship, blah, 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 blah. But let's face it, their time commitments are unlike any other students. And they're not, generally speaking, pushed to a lot of times what they want to study, but pushed to where they can maintain their eligibility and sort of have almost the easiest course load. So, yeah, the expectations are ridiculous. They're 19 years old, 18 years old. They're covered like professional athletes. There's a lot of pressure on them just from their coaches and the university at large. They play in front of gigantic, large crowds. There's a ton of pressure on that. In addition, obviously, to the spoils. Yeah, I think these guys are under an immense amount of pressure. I think they're not compensated at all compared to what they can make for universities. And again, I'm not saying that it's not an incredible honor and privilege and something awesome to be part of a college football team at that level, and you obviously have a chance at the pros and all that stuff. But yeah, I think the media at large too often does not is a little. How would I phrase this? Too often I find that the media, because of how often we see these players on television and because of how hard they are covered, I think we tend to forget that in chronological age just how young they are. And so I think the best people, at least in terms of television analysts, are are as critical of the coaches as they are of the players. And I think the best people covering this sort of cover it with an eye towards that, you are dealing with young people. You're not dealing with professional athletes.
Yeah, and Jeff and I, still being seniors in college, it's crazy to believe that we're older than a lot of these guys who are being scrutinized by the media.
Yep, you are.
But obviously,
I would just say this. Think about this. Think about, for you guys, if there was a reporter assigned to both of you, what would that be like? And it would shape you. It would shape who you are. It would shape sort of where you go. Again, there's a lot of positives from that. You get the benefit of the publicity, and you're in the public eye and that. But think about that. Use it and do a thought exercise, and think about what it would be like if the Los Angeles Times assigned a reporter just to cover you two.
Pretty frightening.
Yeah, think about it.
I had a quick question regarding the upcoming Olympics in South Korea. You touched on it a little bit in your most recent Roundtable podcast, but we have a handful of students here at USC at the Annenberg School of Journalism who are actually going to be leaving for about a month to intern with NBC working in South Korea. And when speaking to these students, kind of on a serious note, but also joking, obviously the politics and the tension, with North Korea and whatnot, has brought up a little bit of concern among students. So the question I had from you, speaking with people who are going to be covering the Olympics or, maybe people from NBC, is there which I'm sure there is, a concern regarding, the political climate in the region, and how do you think it's going to impact the coverage of the Olympics?
Well, I think anybody who's covering it, obviously, I've covered 7 of them, and you're always cautious heading in. Even if it's I covered the Vancouver Olympics. I mean, Canada's obviously a safe country, but you're always cautious about the security. You're always cautious about the political environment, and I think these guys will be that too. You're only 100 miles away from North Korea, so it's a fairly worrisome spot in the world. That said, a lot of times the Olympics, the worries prior to the Olympics sort of turn out to be okay during the games, and security is really tight. And you don't end up, things that you thought you'd worry about turn out not to always be the case. So I think these guys should keep their head up and pay attention to their surroundings, obviously follow all the protocol that they've been told prior to going. But I think generally speaking, I think these Olympics will come off fine. Politically, it was a very important thing that South Korea and North Korea are going to walk into the stadium as a unified team. It's important that the North Koreans are going to compete. That sort of provides a little bit of safety. But as a general rule, the Olympics are among the safest places on earth when they exist because the security apparatus is so great. A lot of times security experts would tell us to be more worried about places outside of the Olympics because the security at the Olympics is so great that there may be some holes in some other places in the globe because so much is concentrated on where the Olympics are. So I think it's a great opportunity. I'm glad for those students. I think you keep your head up, but as a general rule, I think they're going to be fine.
So we got one more question, and we wanted to touch on, again, the podcast you did about a week ago now on people who are under 30 or maybe graduating college, like Jeff and I, who are looking to enter the sports media field. And we had 2 questions on this topic. The first being that in your conversation, some of the figures mentioned that people looking to enter the industry, there's kind of a lack or less of sustainable jobs in the industry, more so than the last few years. However, one of the things that I was thinking of while listening to the podcast is at the same time, there are also a lot of jobs and opportunities that didn't necessarily exist even a few years ago. And obviously, as more and more key players in the industry like Twitter and Amazon and Facebook enter the industry, I think you're going to see more and more of these types of sports media jobs. In your opinion, from your perspective, what are 1 or 2 maybe of the most exciting opportunities in sports media, maybe that are new and up and coming, or maybe 1 or 2 jobs that you feel maybe didn't even exist a short while ago?
Well, I think basically for people your age, I think the more multimedia skills you have, the better chance you can work. So whether that's you have audio skills both on air and production. You have digital skills, both being able to produce, working in CMSs as well as writing. You have video skills, being able to cut and shoot video as well as obviously being on the air. The more of those skills you have, the more potential you're going to have to be employed because what is seemingly clear as the old world places sort of shrink a little bit, more people have to do more stuff at places, and obviously the world is going more digital than print. In terms of exciting jobs, I mean, I think what's really exciting to me would be you have the ability to create your own content, and you have the ability to come up with something without having the apparatus of like a Sports Illustrated or an ESPN. That's what's exciting. And podcasting obviously is an amazing space there, in that once you sort of master or learn the craft of being able to create a podcast and put it up, you in not so long amount of time could get a podcast that gets some significant listeners behind you. And that could be content you own, that could be content you can sell or get sponsors for. So that, I think the most exciting thing for me is just the ability for so many people, particularly people your age, to create their own products, create their own brands. That could not exist when I was graduating from school. You basically, your path had to be you had to work for some kind of organization. I got lucky. My first job out of grad school essentially was SI. But today, if I was a 23-year-old, 22-year-old, 21-year-old college student, in college, I could create my own podcast, and that podcast, maybe by the time I'm 30, could have 100,000 listeners. And if I have 100,000 listeners to my podcast, I could sell against that podcast and make some money. One of the great stories that I heard, this 23-year-old kid named Omar Raja, who founded House of Highlights, which Bleacher Report eventually bought. But the kid basically was just a huge basketball fan, and he started finding all these incredibly cool videos on Instagram, both like people doing cool stuff on the court as well as just like fun stuff in the NBA. And he basically found he put it all together, and he made a home for all this stuff. And then this big company comes along and buys the sort of the name and the premise from him after he basically was getting millions and millions and millions of views. So that's the exciting thing to me, is I think people your age could kind of create and come up with stuff and form their own sort of sports media entities, where if you were coming up in my era, you basically speaking had to work for somebody to have a shot at doing that.
And we really appreciate your insight, and I think you're pretty spot on. The fact that Jeff and I get to do this show and have a guy like you agree to come on is just been incredible. So we really want to
incredible. It's not that. It's, trust me. I'm not LeBron James. It's not that tough to get me.
No, I mean, we both
really
listen to you.
appreciate it.
We really appreciate you coming on. Just real finally, you do this on your show. Is there anything you'd like to say before we hang up, maybe that you'd want to share to up-and-coming people in the sports media industry? I know you just shared a lot of advice, but anything you want to add before you go?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, and I would say this to the people that any young person that I ever deal with is, there's going to be times where it's very hard in the sports media profession, particularly the media profession. The money is not really great at the beginning. You're competing against a lot of people. Sometimes you're going to be out of work at certain times, but you just owe it to yourself to go for it. Don't take yourself out of this profession just because it's frustrating in your 20s. I would say give it a real shot. And some people will eventually leave the profession and, go into business or law school or whatever else they do in their 30s and 40s. But if you really want to be in the media, or if you really want to work in the sports media, you owe it to yourself to really give it an honest shot for a number of years. But knowing it's not going to be so easy. That would be my only advice. It's a very easy business to get discouraged because the supply far outweighs the supply far outweighs the demand. But there's something to be said about being industrious and being committed to it. And most of the people I know who've always wanted to go in the field have eventually found a place there and have found full-time employment. So that would be the one thing I would leave people with, is just when things get discouraged, especially if you are in your 20s, don't give up. You owe it to yourself when you're young to go for it. You'll have a lot of time later on if you ultimately want to switch your career.
We really appreciate that advice. I know as Jeff and I are looking for jobs in the industry, it could be a little daunting at times, but nonetheless, as of now, we're doing what we love. We're trying to do what we love. Anyway,
awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us, Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Writer and reporter for Sports Illustrated, writer for the SI Media column, and host of the SI Media podcast. Highly recommend subscribing. We'll be back in just a few on In the Trenches on this Tuesday evening.
And we are back. That was Richard Deitsch from Sports Illustrated speaking to us. Garrett, that was good for you. That was awesome. Well done.
A lot of fun.
That was a lot of fun. That was really neat. But We forgot to remind you that In the Trenches is on KXSE.org, also on the airwaves, 1560 AM, and on your TuneIn radio app. Moving on, we'd be remiss, as I mentioned, not talking about USC on a USC radio show, but we'd just be remiss as sports fans in general, Garrett, to not talk about the Super Bowl coming up in 2 weeks. We could also talk about it next week, but I want to talk about it now because it's fresh. The Eagles and the Patriots, a rematch of, what year was that, 2000 and
I think it's 2003.
3? Yeah, T.O. and Donovan McNabb were on that Eagles team. You know, it's funny. The last time the Eagles were in the Super Bowl, their path went Falcons. It was Falcons. No, wait. Who'd they play first again? It was Falcons, Vikings, Patriots. And now they have, once again, Falcons, Vikings, Patriots.
I did not know that.
Be very interesting to see if they come out on top this time. But Garrett,
by the way, I don't know if you know this about me, Jeff, but I wasn't much of a sports guy. You know, in my early days, I was more of like a play like fairy tales and imaginary
like a
characters
World
in
of
the
Warcraft
backyard,
type, yeah,
big video gamer.
Yeah.
So that, by the way, that was the first Super Bowl I do remember watching.
I think mine was the Panthers Patriots, the wardrobe malfunction.
Oh no, yeah,
the Janet Jackson one.
That's definitely the one.
Yeah. Anyway, Garrett, really quickly, Eagles, Patriots. This is really interesting. You got Nick Foles, who played the game of his life the other week, going up against Tom Brady. The Patriots trying to win back-to-back Super Bowls. They're in their third Super Bowl in the last 4 years. And believe it or not, Bill Belichick is now in his 11th Super Bowl as a coach. Out of the 52, that is 21% of all Super Bowls played has Bill Belichick been in. It's massive, but I want to ask you, is this the best going into the playoffs? Is this the best matchup I think we could have asked for as for the NFL and as fans?
Absolutely not. And at the end of the day, look, had Carson Wentz been healthy, I think the answer is a resounding yes, but that is not the case. I think out of the AFC, other than Pittsburgh, far away the best case scenario, but I think you make the argument in the NFC that I would have rather seen any of the other 5 teams get in there. I think Minnesota, had they gotten in, playing in their home stadium would have been a fantastic storyline. I mean, look, if you're New England and Belichick, talk about adding a different layer to their resume, winning another Super Bowl, basically in a road game.
No, I mean, not basically.
Yeah, it is a road
game.
I mean, I would have loved to see Drew Brees and the Saints in there instead.
Yeah.
Even Carolina and Cam Smith. So no, I do not think so. What about you?
I'm gonna say yes, because I think these are the two. One, they're both the 1 seeds, and they're the 1 seed in the AFC and the NFC. But also, this is about to be a team. This is going to be one of the best offenses in the league versus one of the best defenses in the league. And it's going to be very exciting. As to last week in the NFC Championship game, you saw 2 of the best defenses. The Eagles are 4th in total defense. They're 1st in rushing yards allowed per game. And you're going to see Tom Brady, who without Rob Gronkowski, and I know how you feel about the whole Gronkowski situation, if he's available to play, This is going to be very, very interesting, seeing Tom Brady go up against a defense that is, I think, just as good, if not better, than the defense that he faced last week that nearly beat him. Granted, before we go any further, really quick, predictions for this game, Super Bowl 52, and talk about why.
So before I give my prediction, it's 2018, and the year of the hot takes has passed us in 2017. Yeah. I'm keeping it simple. I have limited down my sports takes into a sports take Bible. I only have 3 laws in the Bible. Number 1, never doubt Nick Saban, as you saw just a couple weeks ago. Number 2, always doubt the University of Southern California. The higher the expectations, the lower the performance. And number 3, never doubt Bill Belichick / Tom Brady. Look, I cannot see a circumstance where New England loses this game. If you look at each of the past 2 Super Bowls New England has played in, they've been down and come back to win the game. In fact, I'm not positive. I'm pretty certain New England has every Super Bowl that they've won, they've trailed at halftime. So, look, if you're the Patriots, even if things go way south at halftime, I'm still not counting out Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. They've been here before. They know how to win. They're the greatest dynasty football, probably in all of sports of all time. And to come in here and say that Nick Foles and the Philadelphia Eagles is going to beat the Patriots, I just cannot see it happening. And I know I'm not saying anything different or unique here, but at the end of the day, I don't bet against Bill Belichick. I do not bet against Tom Brady. They're going to win number 6.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, this is Nick Foles last week I think there's absolutely no shot that the Eagles have a chance to win this game. I do think it'll be close, but I think...
So you say there's no chance, but it's going to be close.
I think it'll be close, but it'll never be in doubt that the Patriots are going to lose this game. I think it's going to be one of those games where it's going to end up being like 31-21, a closer game than we expect. Granted, it was in Patriots' control the entire time. Granted, similar to... I mean, I'm trying to think of a game that's similar. I don't know. I mean... Yeah. Bama Clemson this year turned out to be, that was a blowout. Anyway, I think it's going to be closer than people expect, but Nick Foles played the game of his life last Sunday against the Vikings. 352 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and their defense was good for a Minnesota offense that was led by who? Case Keenum. One of those guys that were like, all right, when are we going to see the real Case Keenum? We finally saw the real Case Keenum that got benched last year in L.A. for Jared Goff. I'm going to say 31-21 because I agree with everything you said. Don't doubt Bill Belichick. Do not doubt Tom Brady. I am very excited for this coaching matchup, though. I mean, you can't go without saying props to Doug Peterson. This is a team that 2 years ago had the second pick in the NFL draft, and they're in the Super Bowl.
I'm kind of glad you picked New England, Jeff, because I really hate the Patriots, and you're usually wrong with your takes. So
but then I mean,
I'm kind of like in Philadelphia in this one now.
See, I think I'm never wrong though in predicting championships. I predicted Indians Cubs last year.
Is that true?
Yeah, I did.
All right, I won't fight you on it.
Yeah.
Quick question: if by some miracle, in my opinion, Philadelphia is
I predicted the Astros.
All right. So if Philadelphia is going to win this game, how do you think it's going to happen?
Pressure Tom Brady. You saw the Jaguars, as obvious as that sounds, you saw the Jaguars do a very similar thing. They brought blitz packages that Josh McDaniels and Tom Brady were not ready for. This is a defense, once again, that's going to be able to shut down Dion Lewis in that run game. And it's going to be all up to Tom Brady, which, again, is probably a better situation that the Patriots want to be in anyway. But if you can get pressure on Tom Brady, let's not forget he's 40 years old, and make him miserable right out of the gate, start the game out with 2-3 sacks in the first quarter, the momentum switches. Look, the Jaguars nearly won that game.
Yeah, and look, you look at the 2 times New England has not won the Super Bowl, and both times it came against a ferocious front seven from the New York Football Giants. Remember when they had Michael Strahan and Antonio Pierce and Justin Tuck? I'm definitely leaving out a few names there. But yeah, I agree with you. I think pressuring the quarterback is obvious. I'm just going to put it more on Nick Foles because I'm going to say in order for them to win this game, Nick Foles is going to need to control the offense so that the defense could stay off the field. Because if the defense is gassed, Tom Brady's just going to have a field day. You can only get Tom Brady off the field and make him turn over on downs so many times. So, if Nick Foles is as good as he was last week, obviously, Philadelphia's got a pretty darn good shot. But I don't even think he needs to be that good. He just needs to be good enough where, at least once or twice a quarter, he could put together a pretty long, lengthy drive, give the defense an opportunity to rest so that when they are on the field, they keep Tom Brady on their toes, under pressure and whatnot.
This is a tough game for you, isn't it, as a football fan?
This is a nightmare for the New York Giants. I cannot think of a worse possible matchup. I think the Cowboys, to me, look, the Eagles haven't won one ever. The Cowboys haven't won one in so long, but to me, Jerry Jones as a villain is just such a more detestable character than anyone in either of these two teams, other than probably Tom Brady. If I had to pick who I would want to win, I would say the Patriots, and it makes me sick to my stomach saying this, but at the end of the day, and I said this when Alabama won the national championship, it's like when New England wins, it almost feels like a lost season. Like, okay, the Patriots won again. When Alabama wins, Nick Saban, he won another one. When, Golden State, they're going to win another one. Like, what can you do? They're just the best ever. Whereas if Philadelphia, who's never won one, wins one, that's kind of, a knife in the gut for a Giants fan.
Yeah. Interesting enough, I'm looking right here. The conference title ratings were down 8% this year.
But not surprising given that the second game was a shellacking and the first game featured the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is arguably the smallest market in all of NFL.
That team is going to be good next year. Interesting little tidbit. The Patriots are undefeated against bird teams in the Super Bowl.
undefeated against Bert. Who else?
The Falcons, the Eagles, and the Seahawks.
Yeah, it's
and just if we're trying to kill times and just thinking about that type of stuff, I mean, we'll see. We're going to find out. Garrett, take this one home.
Anyway, that is all the time we have for you this week on In the Trenches. I am Garrett Schwartz. With me is Jeffrey Dubrov. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'd also like to thank Richard Deitsch, writer and reporter for Sports Illustrated, for joining us. We had a blast interviewing with him. Anyway, it's Tuesday evening. We'll be back next week at 8 p.m. on In the Trenches. You're listening to KXSC Los Angeles, online at kxsc.org, around the airways at 1560 a.m. Enjoy the rest of your week.